Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about threats. So my name is Herbert Bos. I'm from the VUSAC System Security Research Group at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And should I get closer? Yeah, all right. All right. So this should be better. Okay, so like I said, I'm from the VUSAC System Security Research Group in Amsterdam. And I'm going to talk about threats, or as you might call this talk also, I'm going to talk about abstractions. So I think abstractions are both harmful and also essential, and I'll elaborate on this in a minute. Now, unlike most speakers who generally like to present their work as super important, I'd like to say that my talk is relatively unimportant in the grander scheme of things, right? Climate change, the attacks on democracy, wars everywhere. This is really relatively unimportant stuff, but it's still interesting. And I'll still talk about a grand theme, namely all of human evolution. And human evolution has come a long way, right? So we started out as hunter-gatherers, and now in this day and age we build robots that can, jump over all sorts of things and do backflips and what have you. And how have we come this far? Well, I think there are two main mechanisms that allowed us to reach this stage, namely specialization and abstraction. So from the start of the agricultural revolution, we basically had people free to, to specialize, right? So we had some people who would specialize in, plowing, and some people who would, tend the cows, and other people who would bake the bread, and yet another villager would be specializing in designing the branch predictor of the out-of-order CPU that would drive the robot that would take over the plowing for them. And the reason why we were able to do that is that we could abstract away many of the details. So we had this really complicated robot. We didn't know how it worked internally. We could just think about the way the robot should be used, just like we don't know what's in our laptops, most people, and we don't know what's in our cars. We can just use them. So we can abstract away all of these details. And so we've done this successfully for thousands of years, right? So we are still doing this in designing our super complex software and hardware, right? So we have people who are really very good at designing branch predictors of superscalar out-of-order CPUs, and we have people who are, super good at designing, JavaScript applications that don't need to know anything about the branch predictor of that superscalar out-of-order CPU. And that's great. So we abstract away many of these details, and we can specialize and build really sophisticated things. Okay. We're doing this in design. We're also doing this in fixing stuff, right? So if we have a problem, there could be a software bug, or it could be a hardware vulnerability, and the software bug could be, a spatial memory error or a temporal memory error, and the hardware problem could be, speculative execution vulnerabilities, or maybe faulty DRAMs in rowhammer vulnerabilities. And that's great because we now have specialists that can focus on these problems in isolation. So we can address the problem of memory safety, worry about buffer overflows, without having to worry about all the problems that go on in the world of CPUs, right? So the hardware vulnerabilities such as Spectre and Meltdown and so on. Okay, that's great. And the reason why we can do that is because we abstract away all of the details that we don't care about, right? So I would say this is kind of the first law of software engineering. We build an abstraction, and then we can make use of that and build really complex systems. It's the only thing that we have to allow us to handle with this enormous complex system that we've built, right? With millions of lines of code for the hardware, millions of lines of code for the software. Nobody can understand all of that, let alone how the interaction is with attached devices and remote devices and so on. Okay. And some people even write books about this and have in their books things like, the API being sort of a beautification of the what used to be called the ugly interface, but the publisher no longer allows us to. So this is a book that I wrote with Andy Tannenbaum. The publisher no longer allows us to say that an interface is ugly because it's not inclusive. So now we have to say it's an awful interface, but we can still say a beautiful interface. Okay. So, but anyway, so these interfaces and this layering of abstractions is what we've been doing all along for hundreds of years. Also here in Italy, right? So we have Dante, who envisioned hell as being this set of 9 layers, right? So which was a little bit complicated. So they later simplified this to the 7-layer OC reference model, and each of these layers is only concerned with the tasks that need to be done at that layer, right? So the 4th layer of hell, also known as the transport layer, that's where TCP lives. The people who work on this only need to worry about, I don't know, getting the packet from one application to another application, and maybe about things like reliability and retransmission and so on, without having to worry about the hell below, right? Which is all of the other operating system code, all of the stuff that goes on in your CPU, which is super complicated. So I would argue that these are really fundamental concepts. We have to abstract away the details, otherwise we cannot build these complex systems. We have to partition our concerns, okay? And without that, we cannot understand the world. But on the other hand, these abstractions are leaky. They're broken, and this is where many of the vulnerabilities arise. Just because we rely on these vulnerabilities creates on these abstractions, and these abstractions are not very secure, not very robust, creates a lot of insecurity. Okay, so this is what came out of a discussion that I had with a PhD student of mine. Eric Bosman, also known as Brainsmoke. So a lot of this presentation is built on some of the discussion I had with him, and all of the research results that I'm going to show here are the work of a fantastic group of PhD students. Okay. All right. Okay. So, and I think this breaking down of these layers of abstraction is exactly what is happening in many of these advanced attacks that we're seeing today. Okay, a boundary, or a boundary between processes. And that is, a pretty good boundary. We have modes, different modes, privileged modes that separate the two things. We have memory barriers that prevent anyone from one process to access the memory of another process. And that works really well. Except that underneath all of this, underneath all of these wonderful abstractions, there's a lot of resources that are shared by both of these parties, or all 3 of these parties in this particular case. For instance, the CPU cache, which is giving you your speed, right? That's where you get your fast memory accesses from. And whenever we have something like, I don't know, a crypto algorithm, or crypto algorithms, many of them work like this, right? They iterate over a crypto key bit by bit. And if the bit is 0, they go and do something. And if the bit is 1, they go and do something else, right? And that something and something else are just different routines in memory. And that means that they also are stored at different locations in the cache. So if the bit is, 0, do something will be in the cache. It will be there somewhere. Okay, and if the bit is 1, do something else will be in the cache somewhere. Okay. Now this is a cache that is shared also by an attacker. So if an attacker wants to know the crypto key, what the attacker can do is simply sample the cache and see what is in there. For instance, the attacker uses up a lot of memory, and that will take up space in the cache also. And then iterate over that memory, iterate over an array, or in this particular case, instructions, and see whether or not this is still in the cache, right? So if their instructions are still in the cache, nothing has happened. But then at some point, perhaps the attacker discovers that the access to one particular cache line is slow, and it corresponds to the do something else in this particular case instructions. So that means that the attacker knows that, whoa, there was a bit 1, or very likely there was a bit in the crypto key that was a 1. If the next time he does this again, it turns out that the other cache line is slow. It means that the attacker's data was evicted from the cache, and the attacker knows that the crypto key had a 0 at that particular location. In other words, via this side channel, the attacker is able to glean information from another process or the kernel, stuff that the attacker should not have had access to at all. Okay. So that's where an abstraction breaks down. It really has, it shouldn't have access to any of this. So all of these accesses are fast, and this one is slow. We like to think that there is a clear separation between the kernel and user land, or between two user processes. But really, there are all sorts of ways to leak through this abstraction. And relying on that abstraction is dangerous. Now, this breaks this first law of software engineering, where we really didn't want to deal with any of that, with all the complexity that was under the hood. Right? We should not be concerned about this. But now all of a sudden, we have to worry about how does my code, my cryptographic algorithm, affect things that can be leaked via side channels? Will this actually lead to different cache behavior? And if so, can that actually be observed by the attacker? Now, the cache is just one example. There are lots of other things, right? So here's your memory chips. Your memory chips, we like to think of them as an abstract thing. We write stuff to them, we read it back, and it will be the same value. But this is not the case necessarily, right? So there are occasional bit flips because of, I don't know, cosmic rays, but really there are also ways for an attacker to flip bits in other people's memory through the row hammer attack. So we can no longer fully rely on the contents of memory, the integrity of the contents of memory. There are transient execution attacks such as Spectre and Meltdown and all their friends. We have operating system features that may interact really weirdly with our code, right? So maybe there's memory deduplication implemented by your hypervisor or your operating system that ensures that if 2 pages in memory are exactly the same, they get mapped onto a single physical page. But that is observable by an attacker, right? If you're writing to one of these pages, the write will be slower, and therefore you can detect that somebody else must have had the same content in memory. So you're leaking information about somebody else's memory content. And then there are, traditional software exploits where you were relying on libraries and so on to actually work as you thought they would, but they turn out to be buggy. Then there are physical attacks, and all of these things are worrying our, maybe JavaScript programmer or whatever the programmer is trying to do. Okay. So what I think we do in security research is to try and re-establish these boundaries, right? So we're doing our utmost to make sure that as little information as possible leaks through these boundaries, as little as possible integrity violations are possible through these boundaries. Okay, and that is difficult because that's now stuff that the attacker needs to worry about. So the problem that I want to convey is that even though we thought these were all abstractions that we could rely on, in reality, programmers nowadays have to think about all of the other stuff that is happening in the layers underneath them, the hell that is below, right? So to write secure code, you're kind of now forced to think about how will this interact with some resource on the CPU that you probably never even heard of, right? And that is problematic. So in that sense, this relying on abstractions is indeed harmful. On the other hand, as I argued earlier, it is also essential, because otherwise we cannot build these really complex systems. So this is the problem, really the dilemma that I want to sketch today. It gets a little worse, because the other thing that we rely on is that these things are somewhat separate, right? So we can focus on solving one of these problems, for instance, the problem of transient execution, so there are Spectre and meltdown attacks, or rowhammer, or the traditional software errors, such as memory errors, buffer overflows, and what have you, without having to worry about all the other complexity that is out there. Okay. In reality, right, there's no reason why these boundaries should be observed by attackers. Attackers don't care about your artificial boundaries. They can pick any component from any of these areas and craft an attack with that. Okay. So now I gave a first talk about this a couple of years ago, where I said, you know, this may actually happen. There may be some incidents that we should perhaps start thinking about. And I would argue that now this is actually happening all over the place. So first of all, there are the combinations of, I don't know, cache side channels or contention-based side channels with transient execution attacks. So Spectre and Meltdown, what Spectre say, relies on the fact that there is some way to leak information, right? So, and that leaking of information is generally done via a cache-based side channel, right? So that it interacts together. Then there is the combination of two very different classes of attack, where, you know, not microarchitectural resources such as in the previous case, but we have the operating system doing things, right? So the operating system using memory deduplication, kernel same page merging, to make sure that you only store a page of memory once, right? So if two processors or VMs have the exact same page of memory, what you do is you try to merge them and put them on the same physical page. That is great. It saves a lot of physical memory. But now you can combine that with the rowhammer attack, because you're able to determine now for somebody else which physical page that party will be using, right? And if you know that this is a physical page where you're able to flip a particular bit in memory using the rowhammer vulnerability, you can use that to exploit a neighboring virtual machine. Okay. Similarly, we're seeing combinations of Spectre-like attacks with traditional software errors, buffer overflows, and use after freeze. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And we're seeing combinations of rowhammer and speculative execution attacks, such as Spectre. And I'll talk about that in a minute also, if I have some time. Okay, so just to illustrate what it is that I'm talking about, I want to introduce two attacks, one of them in a little more detail, because it's basically the same attack, although the targets are different. And that combines these speculative execution attacks, these things that we know about since 2018 when they were publicly announced, and the traditional software errors that we've been knowing about since the 1980s, and buffer overflows and so on. And when we talk about speculative execution attacks, we talk about one of the variants of Spectre, right? So Spectre has this, two well-known variants, variant 1 and variant 2, that I'll talk about. And what the variant 2 is all about, you have an instruction that jumps to a calculated address somewhere in your code. So there's a jump to the contents of some value that you calculate in your memory, an indirect branch. And if your CPU would simply execute this as is, nothing bad would happen. But your CPU is trying to be smart. It sees that the last 200 times that you executed this code, you targeted, the target of your jump was this address, right? So let me just assume, if I'm still waiting for the actual outcome of the address, let me assume that it's going to be that address again when we execute this the 201st time. But now maybe something else has happened, right? So maybe you've provided a different value and the prediction is wrong, and the CPU starts speculatively executing instructions that it shouldn't have, right? Nothing bad will happen because the CPU will sooner or later realize that this was the wrong address. It will squash all the results that it obtained so far and continue executing at the right address. Okay. So here's two variants of Spectre. So the one is Spectre variant 1, or bounce check bypass, and the other is what I just discussed, the branch target injection. So you're, as an attacker, mistraining the branch predictor by making it jump to a particular address 200 times in a row, and then making it jump to the wrong address the 201st time, or making sure that the branch predictor mispredicts and starts executing the thing that it thought it had to execute for this particular case also, and therefore execute the wrong instructions, right? And I'll talk about that in a little bit later. Spectre variant 1 is perhaps an easier one to understand. So here we have a little bit of code that exists, for instance, in a privileged domain, say the kernel. It's in the victim. But you're able to interact with the victim and call functions, system calls in your victim. And somewhere in this victim code, there is a fragment such as the one that you see at the top. It does the right thing. It gets an untrusted value, an index in this particular case, which it will use to index an array. But before it does that, it first verifies that it's a valid index. It's in array bounds. So it does a check, and then it does an index into the array with that index if everything is legitimate. It then uses the value of that as an index in a second array. Okay. Now, what the attacker can do is provide 200 times a legitimate, a valid, in-bounds index, so that the CPU starts thinking, well, the 201st time that this is called, it will probably be that exact same in-bounds value again. I can trust this, and I can start executing these lines of code speculatively. So it starts executing this code, and if it was incorrect, so if you accidentally provided or deliberately provided an index that was out of bounds, the CPU will realize, squash the results, and throw away the results, and start executing after the if condition, right? So return an error or what have you. However, in the meantime, of course, these instructions have been executed, and that means that data read from an out-of-bounds index was conveyed into the variable data and used to access a second array. Right? That data is not visible to the attacker, but it does get loaded into the cache. Okay, so let's assume for simplicity's sake that array 2 is shared with the attacker. It need not be, it's not super important, but it makes the explanation simpler. If the array is completely empty, so there's no elements currently in the cache, sorry, the array is not empty, but it's not in a cache, so we make sure that we access a lot of memory, so this is not in a cache. And then if we were to access any of these elements, they would all be very slow, right? Because they're not in a cache. Then we execute the code, the snippet of code, 200 times with a valid index. And then at the 201st time, we access it with an index that is out of bounds. And we read a value that is out of bounds. And let's say we read the value 2, a byte 2. Now we use that value 2 to access this array. What that means is that the second element of array 2 will now be in the cache. So the attacker can basically go over all the elements in the cache again, observe that one element is much faster than the others. So all the elements will be slow, 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 except this one element that is fast. So now the attacker knows that, oh, it's the third element that is fast. That means that the value that I have read in this line must have been the value 2. Okay, and leak information. Okay, now, that's Spectre for those of you who didn't know Spectre. Okay. Unfortunately for the attacker, Spectre attacks nowadays are very difficult. There are all sorts of hardware and software mitigations in your Linux kernel, for instance, but also in your CPU. And that makes it hard to exploit these things and find these gadgets that you can exploit. It makes Spectre attacks really hard. Okay, so what about our traditional software errors, right? So memory corruption. Well, here we do a buffer overflow, and then we override maybe a function pointer or a return address, and we jump somewhere. But where do we jump? Unfortunately, this is now also very difficult because the address space will be completely randomized, and if we take a wrong guess, we jump somewhere, it will crash the kernel, right? That's really bad. So blindly probing in this way is really difficult. Okay. We can do this in some user programs, but we cannot do it in these crash-insensitive programs such as, crash-sensitive programs such as the kernel. Okay. So we have to be very lucky to hit a legitimate target. Okay. But what if we combine these two threat models? They're very different, coming from very different areas. Okay. Well, if we do that, we can use, instead of a misprediction, to infer the target, to make the branch predictor to make the CPU jump to a particular chunk of code in memory, we can use a memory corruption to set that target. Okay? But we make sure that this is used speculatively. So we make sure that whatever memory we overwrite is used as an address during speculative execution. And now all of the Spectre mitigations no longer work because the Spectre mitigations assume that branch misprediction was used to make the CPU jump to the wrong target, right? So you train the predictor by 200 times jumping to the right target and then to one target, and then the CPU will think, oh, it will probably be jumping to this target again. You no longer do this. Instead, you corrupt the jump target using memory corruption, but you execute this under speculative execution. Okay. When we're under a speculative execution, well, these are just speculatively executed instructions. So if they jump to memory that is, not executable, or not even there, not even mapped, that's fine, right? It will not crash your kernel. It's executed speculatively, so the CPU will say, oops, clearly I made a mistake, let me roll this back, and just continue running. So you can probe, you can jump anywhere you want in memory without ever crashing. You have a crash-free probing primitive. Okay. So what we do in our attack is we jump around without crashes. We look for side effects that allow us to infer what we're accessing. Is this data? Is it code? What code is it? What data is it? And then find everything that we want in the kernel, all the information that we want. Okay. So essentially, what we're going to do is combine the two types of, or the essential things from the two types of Spectre variants. Spectre variant 1, where we have this bounce check bypass, and Spectre variant 2, where we have a call to a calculated address, and just keep something that looks like this. Right. So we have a check that in this case takes a long time to evaluate. So the code, the CPU starts speculatively executing these instructions. That is still the same as here. This takes a long time to evaluate. The CPU saw that the last 200 times it was executing these instructions. The index was in bounds. So it can execute these instructions. We do the same thing, so this takes a long time to evaluate, and we make sure that the CPU starts executing this instruction speculatively. But then when we do the indirect call, we don't do this based on a misprediction, such as in Spectre variant 2, but rather we do it based on a corrupt pointer that we corrupted with memory corruption. Okay? These kind of snippets of code are super common in the Linux kernel. They're all over the place, right? So we have many instructions that are really close, where there's an indirect branch, such as the one that we see here, really close to a condition that can be slow, such that it will be speculatively executed. Okay. Now, once we have that, once we can execute a branch such as this one, right, we can make it jump anywhere we want. And no bad side effects will happen, no crashes will happen, because it's done speculatively. So it's completely safe for the attacker to jump around. Address space layout randomization, even if it's fine-grained address space layout randomization, will have zero effect. Okay, so that is what we do, and here is an example of how we abuse this. Say we have a buffer overflow on this page. We're able to overflow a function pointer in the Linux kernel. Normally, if we do this without any speculative execution, we would overwrite the function pointer with some address that we think is perhaps interesting, but then it turns out not to be. It's not mapped memory, or it's because of fine-grained address space layout randomization. It's jumping somewhere where we don't want to land. It will simply crash, right? But now, because this is executed under speculative execution, we can probe, and we can probe, for instance, to find all the code pages, right? So we can find a code page because we provide a value at this address, and then the indirect call will use that value, and then it will target this location on this page. If it's not a code page, nothing will happen. But if it is a code page, we know that there should be a side effect in the cache at that location, at the location corresponding to the value that we used in this function pointer override. We know that this cache line should light up, right? It should be fast now. So if we see activity in the cache line corresponding to the address that we override the function pointer with, we know that we are now at least on a cache, on a code page, right? So we know we have a code page. And this simple trick is already enough to break kernel address space layout randomization in today's kernels, right? Because today's kernels use coarse-grained address space layout randomization, which means that if we find one code page, we can simply go down to the beginning of the kernel. We know this is, so we try the next one, the next one, the next one, until we find something that is not a code page. Then we know we're at the start of the kernel, and from that moment onwards, we know every single function in the Linux kernel will be at the location that we know from our own installation. Because there's only coarse-grained address space layout randomization. The functions are not randomized relative to each other. Okay? So once we know the base of the kernel, we've broken address space layout randomization in today's kernel. Okay. We can find also data pages in this way. For instance, if we know there's a number of instructions that look somewhat like this, there's a load from a value on this same page where we have a memory corruption that is loaded into a register, and that register is used as an address to access memory. We should see activity in the data cache at that line, right? So if we see activity in the data set at that line, we know that we've executed a fragment of code that looks like this. It doesn't have to be exactly this, but it has to be something like this. So we overwrite the function pointer, probe around until, and we keep doing this until we see activity at the cache line corresponding to the value that we wrote in this memory location. Because then it must have executed instructions such as this one. We don't care if it's exactly this code, and this is, of course, pseudo-assembly. We don't care if it's exactly that or a variant of that, but it must have executed something like that. Then we know that it's a data page. Okay. We can go even further and detect actual Spectre gadgets that we can abuse, right? If we know there's a snippet of code that does something like this, it loads a value from memory and puts it in a register, and then uses that register as an address and puts it in another register, and then it uses another value that we've overwritten, and it writes it to a third register, and then it does a dereference of the addition of the two. Well, what we can do is we can make sure that this register, this value that we overwrite here, points to a known value in memory. Okay. So, and at the beginning of at the edge of the kernel code, there are a bunch of pages with known data, right? Zeros, or maybe some value that we know. But if we make it point to a value that is known to the attacker, then we know, and we have also overwritten this particular value here, then we know that what we should be seeing, say here's the value 10 at this location, we know that we should be seeing, if this code gets executed, we should see activity at the cache line corresponding to whatever the value was in this location and the value that was in this location. Combined, we should see cache activity there. This way, we can completely disclose the information of the kernel. Okay, that's enough to leak every data that we have in the kernel. Okay. So what we have done in this particular case, so the last step is perhaps a little complex, but the other steps are relatively straightforward. But what we've done is we've used memory corruption to generalize Spectre, and we've used Spectre to generalize memory corruption attacks. Both become more powerful because of the other. Okay? And the combination is greater than the sum of its parts. I will not show the demo in the interest of time because I don't have a lot of time left. But you can do this and have a look at our website to see the demo. You can get root and do anything you want. Okay. Now this very same trick was later used by researchers at MIT to break ARM pointer authentication. ARM has this protection against corrupting pointers. It's called pointer authentication codes, and it's stored in the last few bits of every pointer. There's an authentication code. It's a cryptographically secure hash that makes sure that if you overwrite using a memory corruption attack the value of the pointer, it will no longer be a valid pointer, because before it's used, it's checked to see if it actually has the appropriate hash function. Okay, and if it doesn't have the appropriate hash function, it will crash. Except, of course, when you do this in speculative execution. So here, what the researchers did was use exactly the same attack as I showed earlier, combining speculative execution and regular memory corruption, and overwrite the pointer authentication code with all sorts of guesses. And if it's an incorrect guess, nothing happens. But if it's a correct guess, it will use that pointer, and the dereference should show a signal in the cache, right? It's exactly the same attack. The researchers kind of forgot to mention that it's exactly the same attack, but it's still, it's definitely a very interesting project with a very interesting target in this particular case. I love the research. Okay, likewise, and it's again a very similar procedure. What the researchers at Georgia Tech did was use a similar trick as what we did with memory corruption to overwrite a function pointer. and jump to a target address under speculative execution so that we could probe crash-free. What they've done is they used rowhammer, so the vulnerability in DRAM chips, to corrupt values in memory to bypass the mitigations of Spectre. So in this case, what they said, there's so many mitigations of Spectre for everything that the attacker controls that we can perhaps no longer find these kind of snippets of code in the victim where we control the index of an array access, right? So we can no longer find anything where the attacker controls the index that is then checked for out of bounds but speculatively used in an array access. Because the index gets masked first so that it is never bigger than the array bounds or whatever trick the defenders have used. But there are still many snippets of code like this where the index is not under control of the attacker. Okay, so what the researchers have done is simply say, well, let's take one of all the other snippets of code that look like this, and maybe we don't control access to this index directly, but we can corrupt the memory using rowhammer. Flip a bit in there and make it access the array out of bounds. So in this particular case, they still bypass the Spectre mitigation by again using a different kind of corruption, not something that is provided directly by the attacker. Okay, so I think it's really interesting and also super frustrating that we're now starting to see all of these combinations from very different fields. And that means that we are now at the situation that if you want to write secure code, you kind of have to know about so many different ways that could be used by an attacker in combination to bypass all of the defenses and to compromise your system. It creates an essential problem for our community because we can no longer survive by being a specialist in memory corruption or a specialist in hardware bugs such as rowhammer or a specialist in speculative execution. You kind of have to know everything about everything to be able to provide proper defenses, right? All of your Spectre mitigations in isolation didn't stop these Spectre attacks. So there's 3 examples where it was not pure Spectre that was abused, it was, Spectre in combination with some other threat. I think that is really an essential problem for our field. It's not something that I can easily see a solution for. Okay, we are at the modeling side, we're hardly able to model the individual components, the speculative execution by themselves, or rowhammer, or traditional software errors, let alone do this for this combination of things. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Okay, and with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.